So one of the most famous philosophers that kind of deal with this, goal of civil rights of treating equals equally and unequals unequally, is a guy by the name of John Rawls. John Rawls, very famous book, Theory of Justice, probably one of the best known 20th century philosophers. He died, it's been 10 or 15 years ago now. I actually died, I think on Christmas Day. But he was like 95 or something. But he very famous philosopher. And one of the things he did was he was all about how do we create a society that actually treats equals equally, gives everybody an equal shot, but recognizes and helps those with advantages and disadvantages. And one of the ideas here is, I was just listening to the radio this morning, and they were talking about potentially giving family leave to all working women as a federal requirement. And one of the things is that was an issue, but that's something that's actually being pushed by Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump's daughter. And one of the things that oftentimes comes up is sometimes I think that when there are some other issues that have been child issues that have been pushed by the Trump administration, like there's been a push to allow the writing off of all child care, which sounds like a great idea until you realize that, right now we have an earned income credit that gives that to people who earn not very much money. But giving everybody the right to write off, child care is kind of a weird thing, because you could have a family with a stay-at-home mother who hires 2 nannies and is now able to write off the nanny's salary on their taxes. And you might say, well, that's only fair. But the question is if you have enough money to stay at home with 2 stay-at-home nannies, and you can write that off, there's a little bit of a question is that really fair when that money, when you could have been paying $5,000, $10,000 in taxes, because you're paying your nanny $60,000 or $70,000, and maybe you would have been paying $20,000 or $30,000 in taxes. That money could have gone to people who don't stay at home because they have to have a job, because they're single mothers or they're single fathers, or who have minimum wage jobs, and could actually provide them with some sort of child care. And so the idea there is one of the complaints that sometimes gets labeled is that, say, for example, when people like Ivanka Trump, she comes in there and she's like, well, I pay for childcare, I should be able to write it off. Okay, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but you're looking at it from your perspective. And when you're looking at it from your perspective, you tend to think, well, how can I protect my perspective? And that's what Rawls says is the problem with the way our society is constructed. We write the rules, we create the rules. Those who have power, those who have money, those who have college degrees, and those who have, all this stuff, they end up writing the rules. Right? They end up writing the rules, and what do? They write rules that are beneficial to themselves. It probably will not benefit any of us. Well, it would actually benefit me a little bit to write off some of the child care costs, but not very much. And at the end of the day, I could probably afford to write off the child. I can afford that extra, $500 in taxes I might pay this year for child care costs that I'm not able to write off. I don't know if it's that much. I'm just kind of guessing. I'm just making up some numbers. But I can afford that. Whereas somebody who doesn't have all the same options or opportunities, they can't afford that. And so that becomes a bit of an issue with why are we letting somebody, who write the rules, who has all these things, and not do it. And so what Rawls suggests, I just want to make sure I made this point. The idea there is that if you let me write rules, I'm going to write rules that look out for, white middle-aged men who are university or college professors. Because I'm a highly put upon member of society as a white male college professor with tenure. And so what happens is that, that's just not the case. I am not. I am not, suffering from a lot of problems in society. I find, that my day is not very seriously encumbered. And so what happens, though, but if you let me write the rules, I'll go, well, how did I advantage? How will this help me? How will this help my kids? How can I do this for my kids? And so the issue is that I will protect my own interests. Maybe subtly, and I may try to look out for other people's interests, but I will disproportionately consider my own interests because It's me, and I'm concerned with me, just like all of us are concerned with ourselves. So what Rawls suggests what's called a cake cutting analogy. And he says, look, it's as simple as this. If you've ever had 2 or 3 kids, and you have like a cupcake, and you say, okay, you guys can split the cupcake. Okay. Well, the problem is if you let like 3 kids, like I was one of 3 kids, one of 3 boys, and if we were going to split like a cupcake as kids, now you could cut it, you have a circle here, you could cut it, 1, 2, but then, how do you measure this circle part versus this wider part versus this circle part? I mean, who's going to get the biggest piece? And you know that if I cut that, I'm going to cut it so that I get the biggest piece, right? And that's kind of what happens with when you let those in power write the rules, they write the rules to their own advantage. They don't consider it. That's why, like, for example, we let bankers write banking rules in Washington. And that's why banking rules are, to a large degree, very in favor of bankers. And when the crisis of the housing crisis happened and there was a meltdown, we bailed out the bankers because the bankers are the ones in charge in Washington. The same thing's true. I mean, we let the oil industry write the rules for the oil industry. There's a little bit of a craziness to this, right? And so basically what he says is, if you have a cupcake and you have 3 kids and you have to tell them to cut it up, the best way to do it is you let the first one cut it, but they pick their piece last. Why? Because if you have to pick your piece of cake last, you're going to make sure those pieces are as even as possible because you're going to get the smallest piece. And so what happens is, essentially, he says, we need everybody to go in the room and to write the rules in such a way that we don't know what place we're going to come back in society. I could come back as a woman. I could come back as African American or Chinese or Indian or whatever, right? I could come back as an Eskimo. I could come back, a native person of this, a native person of the continent, as a Latino. I could come back as a lot of things, right? And so what happens here is, I could come back with a physical disability. I could come back with gender issues. I could come back as homosexual. Who knows, right? I mean, and so what happens is if we don't create rules that will afford everybody an equal opportunity, we shouldn't write rules that give somebody an extra opportunity. We shouldn't write rules that give extra opportunities to those who are, homosexual, or those who are white heterosexual males, or those who are African American females. I mean, we shouldn't write rules that give them special advantages, but we should write rules that will give them an equal opportunity given our current society. Maybe that's going to be things like maybe it would be things like affirmative action, where you give admissions to African Americans and Latinos and other minorities. You give special consideration because of their economic background or their race or other things. Perhaps, and that can be in the case that a lot of schools actually currently practice a form of affirmative action for white males, because males in our society are about half as likely to go to college as females. And so males actually are less prepared. Males, typically, they mature a little bit slower in their teen years, and they oftentimes are still a little wiry, and they're not quite as acclimated towards sitting still in a classroom and listening to lectures. They're typically more hands-on oriented, things like that. And so what happens is if you want to have gender equality in your school, you have to actually admit males who may have actual lower test scores than females. And so what happens is that schools do that form of affirmative action. And so what's wrong with doing that for African Americans? I don't know. But does that create a false problem? I don't know. I'm not suggesting that. All Singer is suggesting is he's suggesting we need to come at it and not just look at it from our own perspective. Not go, well, I'm African American, I want it to benefit the people because we've been disadvantaged. Fair enough, but you also need to think about it. What if that takes the admission spot from a really, really bright, promising, middle-class white kid who, his parents worked all very hard and, they've worked hard. He's not the brightest kid. He's not the, smartest. He's not the richest kid. But now he can't get into Harvard because of the fact that they're letting in people with lower scores of another minority. But they do that with men. And I'm a white male, and I mean, my young white males are benefiting from that. I have two little white kids, white boy male kids, right? I have two little boys, and I will tell you for sure that I want my two little boys to have every advantage that they can have, and I don't want them to be treated unequally. And so what he suggests we need to think about it from that perspective, and to a certain degree, there is some value in that, because the reality is none of us know what our children will be. My children could grow up to be homosexual. My children could grow up and have gender issues. My children could grow up and marry people of different minorities. They could grow up and adopt children. I mean, half my friends on Facebook that have adopted children who are non-white, and they've adopted children with other issues. And so if we don't create a society that provides opportunities for people who only look like us, who only have the same socioeconomic, the same cultural background, the same everything, then we're leaving a disadvantage perhaps to our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren. And we have a vested interest in trying to assure that we set up society with rules that will grant everybody a right. And so when we create rights that are unequal, we need to think about that from the perspective of, we don't know what our kids and our grandkids will have.